All right, welcome. My name is Mark Wallace. I'm with True North Ministry. And, today my name is going to be Cleopas. And with me here is my wife, Mary. Would you like to say hi?
Hi there.
Yep, and also with me are some of the ladies who were first to see Jesus after he rose from the dead. We have Joanna, we have Simone, and Mary Magdalene.
Hey, hello. Greetings.
All right, well, thanks for being here. And also with us is my friend Thomas. Now, it's hilarious that after one single act of unbelief, the other apostles gave him the nickname Doubting Thomas, a name that stuck with him for years. Want to say hi, Doubting Thomas? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm the guy who walked down the road to Emmaus with Jesus in his newly resurrected body and didn't even recognize him. My wife and I spent maybe 2 hours with him. Now, I'm calling this little story time talk the Resurrection Interventions. Now, all of you know what an intervention is. You have a friend who's obviously stuck in life and they're going to hurt themselves if they don't snap out of it. And an intervention is forcing yourself into that person's life at a very specific moment in time in order to improve their situation, to help them get unstuck. And you're going to see that this happened twice on this very special day. So before I get deep into the story, there's a question I hope to answer in this little talk. Why did Jesus spend more time with Mary and me on the road to Emmaus than he did anyone else his first day up? We're not apostles, but our son was. We were not related to Jesus, but we know his mom. We're just regular old disciples. There had to be a reason. And now I know Jesus and all his apostles as well as anyone. We knew most of the apostles since they were kids. All but one of the boys were from Galilee. They grew up around each other. Plus, we had easy access to Jesus and the group mainly because our son James was an apostle. I was like a father figure to the boys, and at times a lion tamer. We were respected and we were accepted. But what started as a fun, exciting, and hopeful year turned deadly as we came back into Jerusalem a few days ago. Jesus was arrested, tortured, and the idiots crucified him. It's hard to figure how the world turned so quickly on him. But what happened 3 days after Jesus' death flat out blew my mind. Again, why did the newly resurrected Christ spend more time with Mary and I on his first day up instead of his own apostles? Why Mary and me? There had to be a reason, and you may be surprised at the answer. Pre-fight checklist. Well, if I've told this story once, I've told it 1,000 times, so bear with me. Young Dr. Luke, the traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, was inspired by God to write about the interview that we had with Jesus as he was trying out his freshly minted resurrected body. Those of you fortunate enough to have a copy of Luke's writings, find the part about our trip to Emmaus. My producer is informing me it's Luke 24:13. Like I said before, Mary and I, like Jesus and all but one apostle, all hail from the Galilee area. Mary and I made a little bit of money over the years. So we also have a little place, a second home in Emmaus. We wanted a little place a little closer to Jerusalem, but not too close. Our home in Galilee is 3 days away. And everyone in Israel walks to Jerusalem maybe 4 times a year for the feast. We wanted it a little bit closer. So in case you're interested, Josephus, that famous historian fella, wrote that Emmaus was about a 7-mile round trip from Jerusalem, which is a little over an hour walk each way, close enough to Jerusalem, but not too close. About 7,000 steps if you're keeping track. Well, Emmaus is a beautiful little town with spring-fed streams, green and lush, huge trees, plus it has natural hot spring baths. Hey, because it's in a strategic spot on the road from Jerusalem to the coast, it will soon become a Roman colony, which means it will be a tax-free zone. Tax-free for everyone who lives there. Looking forward to that day. So after the crazy emotional last 3 days, after the death of Jesus, Mary and I leave the noise and confusion of Jerusalem behind and are walking back to our quiet little place right off the road in Emmaus. The problem is, my lovely wife Mary was not too happy with me for three main reasons. One, because we left our son, the apostles, and all Mary's lady friends while everyone was grieving over the death of Jesus.
You got that right.
Yeah. Two, because all the apostles, including our son, told the women that they were crazy for saying they had seen angels and had seen Jesus up from the dead. Oh, by the way, never call Mary Magdalene crazy.
Well, see, it was crazy.
Three, because I didn't believe my Mary when she told me she had seen the risen Christ.
Watch out.
Honestly, I wasn't expecting Jesus to actually rise from the dead. I was expecting him to rise up and rally the people and take over Israel like a king, like David. And a lot of us thought that. But now he's gone. And up to this point, we left the fellowship of the apostles. Not a one of us men had actually seen an angel, nor any of us men had seen the risen Christ. Only the women said that they did. They just said they did. I guess I had some mansplaining to do. So like the stubborn fool that I am, I told Mary, enough is enough. We're heading home. And that's where the fight began. See, that's where the fight began. Mary didn't want to make a scene, so she hugged our son James, left the rented room where he and all the other apostles were staying. We didn't have any luggage because we typically ate supper and stayed the night at our little house in Emmaus. Mary was fuming.
Ladies, I'm sure that none of you have ever tried to tell your husband something you did and they acted like they didn't even hear you.
No, that can't have happened.
I'll bet none of you ladies have ever been hurried out of a party or a social event or rushed out of a family gathering before you were ready to go because your man wanted to go.
I hear you.
I'll bet that none of you have ever been treated like you're just an irrational and emotional little girl by your big, strong husband.
Okay, girls, we get it. We get it. You're pissed. Now, here's some background as to Mary, is why my Mary got so mad at me. Well, first, some introductions. My wife and sometimes I had been traveling with our son James and Jesus and the other apostle boys off and on for the better part of a year. We gave money, we gave supplies, we gave food, and like a few of the other ladies, my Mary helped support the disciples. And to feed and house Jesus, the 12, and many others over the past year was spendy. And some of those boys also had families to care for, which was an extra chunk of money. Now, I need to familiarize you with three of the other ladies who traveled with my Mary and their entourage. And their names were Joanna, Simone, and a young gal named Mary Magdalene. Why don't you say hi again?
Hi again.
Greetings.
Okay. Now, Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, besides my wife and Jesus' mom, was from a prosperous little fishing village called Magdala. And it's on the west side of the lake, the Sea of Galilee. It was also a Roman resort for the rich and famous. Mary was a poor little rich girl from a well-off family, so she was able to financially support herself and the cause. Mary had once been a hot mess until Jesus healed her and delivered her. Life hadn't been easy for little old Mary. Now, most of you have heard of Mary Magdalene, that she was healed of 7 devil spirits. And I'm also sure you're sharp enough to know that spirits don't always make you howl at the moon crazy. Sometimes they just affect the body. They trigger certain actions or tweak emotions or behaviors. Mary Magdalene is a major player among the ladies. She is totally committed, fully involved, because she and her family are so thankful. And there's a lot more to her than most of you know. And there's a lot more to her than you're going to see. So if you know what's good for you, don't call Mary crazy. Now, Joanna, the other lady who traveled with Jesus and the boys, was a lovely woman named Johanna. Like Mary Magdalene, she too was delivered of physical and spiritual problems. Joanna is a bit older than Mary. She's the wife of Chusa, King Herod's financial steward. And to say they're wealthy is an understatement. He's in charge of all King Herod's finances, payroll, and purchases. Look at Luke chapter 8. You see, Joanna gave a lot of money to Jesus and the disciples. Jesus couldn't have done what he did that year if it wasn't for women like Mary and Joanna. You see, and all of you ladies. Simone, finally, one of the other ladies who was chosen by my Mary was a bold and sassy lady named Simone. And she's the wife of a fisherman named Zebedee. I love saying that name, Zebedee. Simone was a mother of not one, but two loud and boisterous fishermen turned apostles, James and John. Her James was the other apostle named James. Ours was a James too. So there's two apostles named James. Now Jesus once nicknamed Simone's sons as the sons of thunder, Mark 3:17. These two boys were loud, bold, and filled any room they entered. They made a splash even if there was no water. If you know what I mean, these two brothers and their fishing partner Peter seemed to be in Jesus' inner circle of inner circles. Plus, like I said before, our son James is one of the 12, which is why we had backstage access to Jesus. My Mary loved and respected Jesus and loved spending time with our son James. You got to remember, they've been out for a year now. And she and the ladies had seen miraculous healings, seen lives changed instantly and forever. Blind men could now see. Jesus and Peter walked on the water. Storms were stopped. Fish were caught. Thousands were fed miraculously twice. At least 3 people were raised from the dead over the past year. One of them just recently, a guy named Lazarus. He was that wealthy young man who was a friend of Jesus's, and he'd been dead and in the grave for 4 days, and Jesus healed him. Wow! And it makes me think if you can be healed of that disease called death, you can be healed from anything. But I digress. Like all the ladies, Lazarus and his sisters were also big financial supporters of Jesus and all of us. Now, leaving Jerusalem and the boys. Now, my Mary was super angry with me because after all the miracles we had seen and talked about over the past year, I didn't believe that she had seen the resurrected Christ. And that was a bridge too far for my little head to think. I just couldn't imagine. So we said our goodbyes to the boys. We left the rented room our son was staying at with the other apostles. We wound our way through the noisy, dusty, crowded streets of Jerusalem and walked out the western gate of Jerusalem into the setting sun. It had been a crazy, confusing day, but it was nice to be going home. Jerusalem was set on a hill, so the afternoon view heading west was breathtaking. It always was. We started walking down the Roman-built cobblestone road, heading downhill to our beautiful Emmaus. The trees were already in full leaf, and the road dropped softly into the valley like a song. The sun was in our eyes. Once we were a few hundred yards away from Jerusalem and had managed to separate ourselves from the other travelers leaving the city, we went at it. I was angry that Mary had embarrassed me and our son there in front of the apostles, and she was none too happy with me because I didn't believe that she saw what she saw. We were having one of those low voice, act like you're not having a fight kind of fights. Intervention number 1. Now, have you ever had a stranger just walk up behind you and you know they're listening? So you try to talk a little bit quieter and switch to that quoted talk that only good friends and married couples know? Well, that was us. Out of nowhere, this other traveler was literally walking in step with us. He basically just joined us. He made himself part of our walk. And when you're riding in a cart, you can talk alone, but when you walk, anybody can join you, and they sometimes do, especially people who live a great distance away. They're lonely. This traveler seemed to listen intently to us for a few minutes, smiling and looking at each of us as we argued as privately as we could. And then he started asking us questions. Now, don't you love it when someone you don't even know joins into your conversation and starts asking you questions? We had no clue who this guy was. Those of you who live in a city can usually pick out the tourist, can't you? This guy looked like an out-of-towner. He dressed like a traveler, and he talked with the unmistakable, sun-bleached accent of someone from the coast. Dude. So we didn't realize it at the time, but this visitor began to feel us out and skillfully started to redirect our conversation. But we didn't mind. It was a nice break to distract us from the crazy week and from our little fight. Plus, the young man looked nice enough, was about our son's age, and seemed very interested in our conversation/argument. Now, here's how I remember it. Luke 24:17, summarized. This is the traveler. Your conversation seems a bit heated and unhappy. Plus, you look a little sad and angry at the same time. Mind if I ask why? Well, I say, we stop walking and we just stand there, mouths open in disbelief, looking at this eavesdropper. Who the heck is this guy? I look him in the eye and say, how is it even possible? You've been in Jerusalem for the past few days and don't know what's going on. Did you just fall out of a fig tree and hit your head? You must be the only visitor in Jerusalem who hasn't heard what happened. And you're the only one who doesn't know really what happened to Jesus. What are you talking about, man?
We've been arguing about a man named Jesus from Nazareth. He was a mighty prophet who did amazing miracles and preached powerful messages to anyone who would listen. Our chief priests and authorities hated him, were jealous of him, and tricked the Romans into executing him, crucifying him. They just nailed him to a post like a common criminal on a busy road between four criminals.
Hey, we've been hoping that Jesus was the one. The one who would liberate all Israel from Rome. We thought the movement was really happening, we were really beginning to move things. And then our teacher, our rabbi, our friend Jesus was killed. Anyway, that all happened exactly 4 days ago. Earlier today, some of the women in our group, including my Mary here, really shocked us. They went to Jesus' tomb early in the morning, but came back and said they didn't see his body anywhere. It was gone. The women told everyone in the room what they saw. We were horrified.
That's just part of the story. Here's how it really happened. 3 days earlier, my girlfriends and I, Mary Magdalene, Simone, Joanna, and a couple of others had seen Jesus buried improperly. We saw Joseph of Arimathea just wrap Jesus in a clean sheet and place him in a tomb he had recently paid for, someone to carve out.
Just so you know, Mr. Traveler, sir, the girls didn't believe that Nicodemus, they didn't know, and they didn't believe that Nicodemus actually reburied Jesus in traditional grave clothes, wrapped like a mummy and covered with maybe 75 pounds of sweet-smelling ointment or paste.
Whatever. Well, we went and bought the spices and grave wrappings, and we're going back to the grave after the weekly Sabbath, late Saturday, early Sunday, to bury Jesus the right way. Mm-hmm. So early this morning, we gathered the spices and wrappings and went back to the grave. We had no idea how we were going to have access to the grave because of the Roman guards there. We also didn't know how we were going to roll the heavy stone off the opening. We would deal with both of those issues when we got there. As we got close, a shock went up our spines. We noticed that someone had already moved the huge stone that covered the tomb and that the guards were gone. Something was wrong. We stooped down and looked inside the tomb, and there was a handsome young man just sitting there. As you can imagine, it struck us as a bit weird for someone to be sitting in an empty tomb. It turns out the guy was an angel. He told us Jesus was not there, that he had risen. It was a little bit freaky, if you know what I mean. So we hustled back to tell our sons, my husband, and the apostles in the B&B.
Come on, Mary. Stop filling this guy's head with your silly stories. That's crazy talk.
No one believed us. Not our son James, not the apostles, not my husband here, not anyone. Very frustrating.
The traveler just smiled in his West Coast smile. at us. So it's sort of weird. Now, hold on. Now, I got to say, hold on a second, Mary. Didn't one of Jesus' apostles, Peter, and another young man run to the sepulcher right after you guys did for a look-see after you told us that your tall tale? If I remember right, all Peter saw was the hollow tube of grave clothes in like an empty cocoon shape of a human body, but no Jesus and certainly no angel. Peter told us that he thought the Romans had pulled the body out of the grave shell and hid it. But he said that the other young man that was with him seemed to believe. The kid actually believed that Jesus somehow rose up through the grave wrappings. Now that got me scratching my head. It didn't make any sense to me. Peter and the kid went back to the rental and told everyone there that the body was gone, but the grave wrappings were just lying there in the hollow shape of a man, but empty. Crazy. We were super confused. We found out later that young Mary Magdalene had left the room alone by herself and followed Peter back to the grave and stood back a little bit just watching. That's from John 20.
Me and all the other women went back for a second look after Peter left. Mary got there first. She was quite a bit younger than us. I think she went back for a second look because she had to make sure she saw what she saw. Nobody likes to be called crazy, especially Mary, because of her past. Now, the story really gets good. Moments before the rest of us ladies got to the grave, Mary Magdalene was already there in tears. She stooped down, peeked in, but this time she saw not one, but two young men, one at the head and one at the feet of the hallowed grave clothes. These two young men asked her, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "What?" Young Mary Magdalene didn't yet believe that Christ was risen, so she told the two young men she needed to know where the body was taken. Have I told you? Mary is pretty bold. This time, she didn't even think they were angels. Again, it's weird that Mary actually had a conversation with two men sitting in a tomb and calmly talking to her. But hey, she's Mary Magdalene. Us older gals hadn't yet made it to the grave. Plus, we wondered again, what happened to the Roman guards? Could we be arrested? Was this a trap?
Young Mary Magdalene told us that all of a sudden she had that feeling you get when someone is standing silently right behind you in your comfort zone. Young Mary whips around and still bawling her eyes out and sees a man standing there dressed like a gardener. You see, like the caretaker of the cemetery. The gardener also asked her, why are you crying? And what she was looking for. See, for some reason, at this point, our traveler friend broke into this huge smile.
Young Mary then asks that gardener where he moved the body. He didn't answer.
See, Mr. Traveler, if this gardener guy was Jesus, I'm not sure how Jesus could have been able to keep a straight face. He had to be coming out of his skin. This would have been Jesus' best acting job ever. The first resurrection appearance incognito.
Don't get ahead of the story, Cleopas. Well, Mary Magdalene turned back to the tomb, still crying, and the gardener guy behind her then said her name in a special way that only Jesus said her name. "Mary, it's me." She recognized his voice, turned around, and poof, right before her eyes, the gardener turned into the beautiful and strong pre-crucifixion looking Jesus. I just got to say, Jesus was one good-looking boy.
I guess if you're the son of God, you
Why
got
not?
it. You got something.
Why not?
Well, that's the instant that Mary Magdalene said that she realized it was Jesus. And this would have been his second form change that day. I just thinking about this, I was thinking crazy story, crazy ladies. Now, I still didn't believe a word of what they're saying, John 20. Now, if it was only true, that would have been quite a moment. You see, it would mean that young Mary from Magdala, one of the most supportive and faithful women ever, was the first person on earth to see the risen Christ, Mark 16:9. I don't think so. Sir, I think the girls are crazy.
Cleopas, Mary didn't just say she saw Jesus, she saw Jesus. Young Mary reached out to touch Jesus, but she told us, Jesus said, "Don't touch me yet because I still need to ascend." I'm not sure why he said this because of what happened next.
See, I told the traveler at this point that here is a story where the story in my mind goes a little bit wonky. It just doesn't make sense to me. Within seconds of Jesus telling Mary Magdalene not to touch him, the other women, Joanna, Simone, a couple of others, and my Mary, they showed up and they just fell at his feet. They grabbed him, hugging him, and he didn't stop them. Now, why did he stop Mary? I don't know. Maybe Jesus was just having fun with young Mary. Maybe it was for dramatic effect. I don't know. Jesus was a joker at times. We all know that. But I still don't believe the girls, just so you know.
Let me tell you my own story, Cleopas. Well, Jesus was there with us for a minute or so, and then he just disappeared, vanished. We looked at each other. What just happened? We all went back to the room where all our stubborn men were gathered, but this time we had radiant smiles on our faces. We were animated. We were stoked. We were blown away. We told the sad-faced men that this time we didn't just see an angel, but all of us actually saw Jesus. We told the stubborn, sobbing men in no uncertain terms, he is risen. True to form, the apostles and the other men, including my husband, Cleopas here, still didn't believe us. Their unbelief was unbelievable. What's it going to take for our big, strong men to believe? Jesus actually rose from the dead.
I still don't believe you. I don't get it. You women really believe this?
Yes. Come on, Cleopas.
Yeah. Come on, Mary. Come on, girls. Why are you filling this traveler's head with your foolishness? Haven't we all been through enough these past few days? I just, and then it was weird that the traveler just smiled at us, and then he took control of the conversation. And then the traveler said, "Come on, you two. Why are you being so five senses? Why are your hearts so sluggish? When it comes to believing what the prophets have been saying all along. Come on. Didn't they all say that it had to happen this way? Didn't the anointed one, the Christ and Messiah, have to experience all kinds of sufferings before he could finish his work, rise from the dead, and come into his glory? Look, if you two are heading to Emmaus, and since we're talking about the Christ, I have just enough time to share with you from memory every single scripture concerning the Messiah, starting with Moses and then working through all the prophets. Would you like that?" Sure we would. I have put to memory every single verse that mentions the Messiah. And so an hour or so should do it. You guys ready? Then I say, then this traveler dude broke into quoting and explaining every single verse about what the prophet said about the Messiah. Some I knew and some I didn't. And I knew the scriptures pretty well. But this guy, he flat out knew some scripture. And he knew about the Messiah like nobody's business. But he was talking, but as he was talking, something began to change in me. Sorrow turned to hope. And the lights were turning on inside me again, and they had gone dark. Who is this guy? The hour walk home seemed like a minute. Just as the traveler finished reciting the passages concerning our Christ, we got to the lovely town of Emmaus. This guy blew us away, as Mary said. So instead of arguing or weeping or grieving, we were on fire. We were burning inside. I think Mary and I have a new friend. We didn't want him to stop sharing the word with us, so we invited him over for dinner. But instead of accepting our invitation and following us into our home, he acted like he was just going to keep heading west toward the coast. Who does that? And who wouldn't want Mary's food?
We basically begged this guy to stay over because it was supper time and the sun was almost down. He had to be hungry. He had to need a place to stay. It blows my mind, but it was still Sunday. So much had happened today. Well, our amazing new friend finally came in and sat with Cleopas and I prepared some food.
Okay, Mary always had some food partially prepared when we leave in the morning. So our new friend just sat down with me and we talked and we waited for dinner. Now remember, I didn't recognize this guy, okay? And when the bread and wine were served, something happened that rang a bell in our hearts. The traveler did something that the apostles had been talking about since the Last Supper, that they had been with Jesus. They called it the memorial or something like that. Only a few of us knew about this. It was when Jesus said at the Last Supper with the apostle boys that the bread represented his broken body and the wine represented his blood that was shed for our forgiveness of sins. He told them that every time that we eat or drink anything, we should remember that what he went through for us. And I guess that's why they call it a memorial. But what happened next pretty much stunned us. This traveler, our new best friend, didn't wait for us to serve him. He served us in our home. Now that's different. That's not our culture. That's not our custom. Maybe guys from the West Coast do things a little differently. But he took a small, warm, round loaf of bread that Mary had just made and set out. He picked it up and he blessed it and he broke it and he gave the pieces to us. And if I remember right, the only time those four words were used together, took, blessed, broke, and gave, was at the miracle feeding of the 5,000 during the Last Supper memorial and now here in our house in Emmaus. Our guest took, blessed, broke, and gave us the bread. And this breaking of bread ceremony is what some people now call communion or the love feast. And because people who love the risen Christ remind each other of what he accomplished every single time they eat together. We do it, but I just jumped way ahead of myself. The traveler, without waiting for us, took a loaf of flat bread, stuff that Mary just made, and he blessed it with a prayer of thanksgiving. And it was a good prayer, by the way. And he thanked the Father for that bread. And he thanked the Father for us. And then he broke off a piece for himself and he gave the rest of the loaf to us. And he said, "Take and eat. This bread represents the body, my body, which is broken for you for your healing."
The second our new friend gave us the bread, the traveler instantly changed into regular-looking Jesus, the one we followed for a year. Cleopas and I looked at each other. What just happened? Can you imagine? We both recognized him. Jesus then gave us an ear-to-ear grin, and then he just flat out vanished. Poof, he was gone.
Yeah, I was like, "What?" And Mary was like, "What?" I mean, just think about it. Imagine a guy looking like somebody from the West Coast, all of a sudden changing into Jesus. You know, at that right when he broke that bread, that's what happened, and it's a lot to take. It's a lot to take. You know, I finally believe that he's risen. I finally believe that he's risen. I finally believe that Jesus did actually rise from the dead. I finally believe my wife.
I told you so.
Well, you know, we realized we just spent about 2 hours with the newly risen Christ.
Yeah, something.
Imagine. It's unbelievable. You know, I'm the first man to see the risen Christ. But here's something. I still didn't understand why he spent all this time with us. Now, I'm sure I'm going to, and I'm sure that we all will.
Cleopas, my heart felt like it was on fire when we were walking with him down the road and when he was sharing those scriptures. Talk about hot flashes. Hello.
I wouldn't know, you know, but Mary, those scriptures he quoted one after the other for almost an hour ignited something in me like I'd never experienced before. I can't really believe that he's up, but I do believe it. I can't believe it, but I do believe it. So I'm so sorry to have doubted you, Mary, when you told me that you had seen him earlier. So now you've seen him twice.
Yep, I have. We better hurry back to Jerusalem because Peter and the boys need to hear that Jesus did rise from the dead. Our son James needs to hear this from us.
You know,
Oh boy, James isn't going to believe this.
maybe he will.
I
Well,
hope so.
you know, we were so excited, so pumped. It didn't take us an hour to get back to Jerusalem this time and to the house the boys were staying at. We were there in a flash, but not as fast as Jesus. You know, it was fully dark outside when we got back to Jerusalem, and we walked into the room where our son and the apostles were staying, but something was different. The guys were acting strange. All the women were still there, but only 11 of the 12 apostles were present. Young Thomas had left for a breath of fresh air.
Hey, I just needed a breather.
Oh wow.
I think we all needed a breather. This meant that Judas was still there when we came back. Now, I had my suspicions about that boy. Me and Mary both did. Judas always acted a little bit funny, but this time he was literally squirming. And something seemed a little bit off now. You know, I'm not sure why, you know, but imagine how Judas felt in that second. So, before we could tell the boys what had just happened to us back in Emmaus, a few of the apostles interrupted and told us that Jesus had appeared to Peter. And most of the men still didn't look convinced, but they were listening. We noticed they were skeptical of even Peter.
Until we got there, there was no one. Excuse me? No man to go along with Peter's story. The women had been trying to convince them. Talking to those men was like talking to a wall. But now Peter said that he saw Jesus too. This will help because he is a force.
Yeah, Peter is a force, let me tell you. That guy is something. Well, me and Mary looked at each other with that knowing glance of married couples, you see, and Jesus, Jesus vanished from our home in Emmaus and somehow made it to Jerusalem in record time. Now, I don't know how he did it, because we were fast. I mean, we were super fast going back. But he had enough time to go back, find Peter, and talk to Peter. And this all happened in the hour that it took us to race back to Jerusalem. Now, the moment Jesus disappeared from our dining room, the moment he disappeared from our house, while he was doing that communion thing, Jesus somehow instantly appeared in Jerusalem, meeting with Peter alone.
As amazing as it was to realize that Jesus rose from the dead, we now realize that the reason Jesus spent so much time with us, did an intervention with us, was because we were supposed to do our own intervention with these stubborn apostles and our son. This whole event happened so that we could get them to see that Jesus rose from the dead. Except for my husband and maybe Peter and that other young guy who was with Peter earlier, not a single one of the apostles believed Jesus rose from the dead, not even our son. His rising from the dead is still the single most important detail of the day. Probably any day, we now realize that it was our job, me and Cleopas, to get those apostles to believe that Jesus rose from the dead.
Now, okay, so this is the second intervention now. First, it was with us. He had to get me believing. Mary already believed. Now I have to go and convince all these strong leaders that Jesus rose from the dead, and none of them believe. None of them believe yet. And now Peter had seen the risen Christ, but that doesn't mean anything. So in hindsight, we now know that for anyone to get born again, they have to believe that that Jesus rose from the dead. And most of the apostles still don't believe, but all the women do.
Yes,
all you women do.
We did.
You see, our son and the other apostles finally gave us the floor to talk. Now remember, we just showed up there. We wanted to tell everybody the story. We were excited. And they wouldn't let us talk because they wanted us first to know about Peter. Okay, now they gave us the floor. They really gave me the floor because Mary had already talked and all the women had talked and they didn't believe the women at all. Maybe they would believe me. And remember, I'm like a father figure to these guys. I'm the age of all their fathers, you see. And so our son and the other apostles finally gave us the floor to talk. After all, they loved us. Plus, we were 15 to 20 years older than any of them. And that gave us an element of respect. So after the apostles stopped discussing if Peter really saw Jesus or that he too was crazy like the women, Mary and I finally had our chance to share what had happened on our walk to Emmaus with the resurrected Christ. Now, weirdly enough, from the looks on most of the faces, most of the apostles didn't believe us, nor did they believe Jesus was risen. But I think some were warming up to the idea. Then Mary and I broke into telling some of the verses our traveler friend had shared and how he took, blessed, broke, and gave bread like the apostles had said Jesus had done during their Last Supper together. And they started looking at each other. They started squirming, and they squinted their eyes, and they furrowed their brows. And then it happened. As we were telling the story about the traveler in our home, how he picked up Mary's bread and saying that it represented his body, and that was broken for our healing. Poof! Jesus himself in all his glory appeared in the middle of the room where we were in the center of the room at the exact same point in the conversation where he had disappeared at our house at the exact same moment. Talk about emphasis. Talk about theatrical timing. Do you think the bread and the wine, the broken body and the shed blood and the resurrection are important? I would say so. So now the lessons of the intervention. Now we know that the reason the newly resurrected Christ spent so much time with us was because he needed us, Mary and me, to help him convince the apostles that he did, in fact, rise from the dead. The apostles trusted me. Jesus trusted me. I was James's dad. I supported them financially for the full year. I knew that these boys since they were kids. My Mary traveled with them for weeks, and I did sometimes. We were disciples too. You know, Jesus knew that a respected man, a father figure like me, could help begin to convince these stubborn young men to believe that he had in fact risen from the dead. The women already believed. Time was of the essence. We now know that he only had 40 days, actually 39 days, to convince all the apostles that he did, in fact, rise from the dead. Jesus needed someone that all the apostles would listen to. He knew that because I was the father of James, they would at least hear me out. Jesus also knew that we would repeat many of the verses that he, looking like an out-of-towner, had told us on the road to Emmaus during our intervention. He also knew that I would mention the communion. See, it was only them that would understand this. Only the apostles. Now I call it an intervention because I was so darn stubborn, so closed off, so blind. I needed someone to wake me up so I could wake others to the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. I call it an intervention because Jesus himself had to intercede and try to help modify my believing behavior so that Mary and I could do an intervention with the apostles. Now, nobody outside that room would have known how Jesus handled the memorial of the bread and the wine at the Last Supper. No one but the apostles. And now us. Well, the intervention worked, both of them. Jesus intervening with us and Mary and I intervening with the apostles and our son. That day we were able to help a few of these apostles over that believing hurdle of believing that Christ truly rose from the dead. Most still didn't believe yet, but at least they were listening. It would take almost 40 days for the 11 appearances. Now I said 11. For all 12 to believe that Jesus really and truly rose from the dead. But that's a whole nother story. Yeah. We'll get to that later. Most of the apostles still thought that what the women saw was some sort of vision or an angel or some fancy trick set up by devil spirits. These men had seen a lot over the past year. So when Jesus just like when Jesus walked on the water that one time, they all thought he was a devil spirit. They thought that the Christ was a devil spirit. So you can sort of understand this. Some of the apostles and maybe our son were finally ready to hear that Jesus was raised from the dead some 72 hours after he was buried, and he appeared 5 times his first day up. The first person Jesus appeared to in his resurrected body was a young, beautiful, faithful, and supportive and sane Mary Magdalene. Next, moments after he appeared to Mary Magdalene, he appeared to my Mary here, to Joanna, to Simone, and a few other ladies.
He did.
Yes, he did.
Yeah. They held on to him like there was no tomorrow. Third, he did an intervention of sorts with me and Mary on the road to Emmaus. It was the second time Mary had seen him, but the first time for me.
I saw.
Fourth, as we were speed walking back from Emmaus to tell the others in Jerusalem, Jesus appeared to Peter alone. And fifth, the fifth and final time Jesus appeared in his resurrected body, that first day up, was when Mary and I were sharing with the apostles what had happened in Emmaus, and he just appeared in the room that we were all sitting in. Whoa. It's freaky, folks. It's crazy. This time Jesus looked like it. Now, this time when he appeared in this room with all the apostles, his hands and feet were pierced like when he was crucified, but the rest of his body was not all beat up.
Yeah.
So he looked a little different, plus he ate with us. He ate with us.
Wow.
So now you know you're going to get to eat in your resurrected body someday.
Let me see. First he looked like a gardener. Then he turned into regular Jesus to Mary Magdalene. That's the first and second change. Then he spent an hour looking like an out-of-towner, but changed into regular Jesus while breaking bread, and then vanished. That was the third and fourth changes. Finally he appeared in the apostles' rented room with holes in his hands and feet, but not all beat up. That was change number 5. What a crazy day. What an amazing Messiah. What a Savior. He is risen.
The ladies and I played our part the first day up to help Peter and a few of the other apostles believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Now it's weird, but even seeing Jesus appear in the room for the 5th appearance that day still didn't convince some of the doubters. I guess believing that someone rose from the dead can be a stretch for some people. Now, Luke once reminded us that Jesus said that if people don't respond to what the prophet said about the Messiah, they won't even be persuaded if they actually saw him rise from the dead. Luke 16:31.
Didn't young John the Apostle also remind us that Jesus said, "Blessed are they who have not seen and still believe"?
Yeah, he did. He sure
Yeah.
did. Now, after appearing 5 more times that day, Jesus appeared at least 6 more times over the next 40 days, leading up to his big reveal on the day of Pentecost. Now, it took 40 more days before every single one of the apostles were able to believe that Jesus did, in fact, rise from the dead. We know now that the only way to receive Holy Spirit, the only way to get born again, the only way to become a son or daughter of God, a brother or sister of the Christ, is to believe deep in your heart that God raised Jesus, our teacher, the long-awaited Messiah, from the dead. The big lesson of the day is for each of us, for you and I, to believe that Jesus Christ did in fact rise from the dead, and he is still risen. Let's say it one more time, ladies.
He is risen. Woo!
So to help the apostles, and all you disciples believe that Jesus rose from the dead is a reason for our resurrection intervention. God bless you all. I love you. And that's our story, and I'm sticking to it.
All right.
All right.
All right.
Preach, Cleopas, preach.